Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Reilly.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Reilly. And as you can tell by the lack of boxes here, there's no guest. I got a wonderful suggestion from, shout out to Lou Perez, but I didn't plan on doing it now. He talked about Will and I we have so many wonderful guests and conversations that every once in a while we should take a break and just talk about what we've talked about and what's going on. So I was kind of contemplating that, and then a week of busyness and came up and craziness in the news, and Will and I didn't really connect that much. So I'd love to hear, you get a bonus of, 30, 40 minutes of Will opining on the issues of the day. And I thought we'd do that. So Will, welcome to your own show.
Great to be on.
Yeah. Great to be on. These are great people. So I had a couple of things. Obviously, if you bring up anything else or the conversation goes somewhere else, we talk about that. But there's a lot of crazy going on. And one of them I wanted to talk about. They all kind of bleed into each other. But I wanted to start with a discourse that I had about Glenn Greenwald's Twitter post. So Glenn was commented this time specifically. I know he's been going pretty hard about calling out hypocrisy where he feels he sees it on the right. Joining, not just because they're joining Israel, but because they're, buying into this, they're being attacked and they're victims. And I guess he doesn't think that they should see themselves like that. He referenced Batia because Batia talks about that a lot. And I don't think they're wrong, but the tweet was interesting to me. This specific tweet was in reference to an MIT student, Jewish woman who was on CNN, talking about how she felt unsafe with the protests and some things that were going on campus. Now, when I listened to the clip, I commented before I listened to the clip, but when I listened to the clip, she mentioned a few things that went beyond just protests and saying free Palestine. But beyond that, so he said that she's not a victim and she was being kind of whiny. That I was kind of like, I can see where he's coming from. What I took issue with was the second part, which I'll get to. But first, you have some thoughts on that victimization of Jews in this current time. So what do you think about that part?
Well, I mean, I think there are two things here. So first of all, people do exaggerate risk to them almost always. It's a human trait. It's one of the things we study in my field. So in reality, the risk to you as a Jewish student, I think this was at Columbia, which
MIT. She was at MIT.
MIT. Oh, I mean, that's, I don't mean to make jokes, but that's very similar. I mean, so you're talking about Ivy League level institutions in Boston and New York. Mm-hmm. How many Jewish students are there on those campuses? I mean, I'd bet it's a solid 8 to 10%. Mm-hmm. And how many attacks have there been where someone was even hospitalized, not knifed, not killed, broken nose? And I would guarantee you the figures are, multiple thousands and none. So people are bad with risk. I mean, when you see a crowd outside your window, it's perfectly natural to tie into almost that race memory as an Irish or Jewish or Black or whatever American and think the mob is coming and feel very, very at risk. In reality, I mean, there's a full on-campus police department at every Ivy and at MIT. They have guns. You have a locking cast steel door in your room. So it's probably correct that you're not actually going to be hurt or killed. That said, I mean, I kind of think the reverse of Glenn, which is where I think you're going. I think it's funny that the same people who argued that hearing the wrong pronouns for your made up gender is a demisexual, non-binary person and so on, that was going to make you kill yourself. But this is perfectly normal. This might lead to it worse than ass beating or an argument, but that was never a risk for all the stuff they've been panicking about. So yeah, last line, there's no equivalent in modern Black life. And I actually just retweeted one of the things you said about this. There's no equivalent for a mob chanting gas the Jews or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, beat the IDF. The equivalent would be go back to the South is something like that. That's not happening at all. So no, I don't view the situation of Jewish kids right now on these campuses as comparable to the situation of sort of pampered upper middle class blacks at the same institutions. I do think it's true that they're not going to be hurt or killed. Neither are Arab kids on these campuses. You might see a Jewish fraternity, a Muslim fraternity brawl, two guys get black eyes. That's it. You're not going to see deaths, rapes, anything like that.
Right. Well, I think you make a good point about, so you took the other side of it where the left was saying get over it, but they were saying, they were having cry-ins and the like. But that was the only part that I was really commenting on. And I think what shocked me was I get pushback from people, but and I don't mind people disagreeing with me, but I think they misunderstood what I was saying. So I don't think I sent you the Twitter trail or whatever, but I think it would be interesting in the sense that I commented, and then a couple of people commented to me, and I actually text Batia, and she says, I agree with Glenn. And I was like, but I think you're missing what I'm saying. Her point, they're focused on whether the Jewish people are victims. And, I already knew where she stood on that. She's been on media. She always says that American Jews are the safest Jews in the world. But I don't know if you noticed this part. What Glenn did was different. Glenn said, all of you people on the right who are siding with this woman as a victim, but then you mock the people on the left who did this, you're a hypocrite. So my point was, are you really saying, like you just said, whether she's like overblowing whatever threat may be around her, that may be true, but whether when as a Jew you hear a student say free Palestine and you take it to the level where she said I hate Jews, and you might say you take it too far, he's equating in my mind that to a black student who applies to a predominantly white college that has 90% white students. They get in, they show up on campus, and then they say, I feel unsafe because there's so many white people around, right? It's that, skiing while black, or we need more black people to go camping because camping is racist, that kind of stuff. So to compare those two and say, if I mock that, right, and I'm saying I can understand why a Jewish person would be, kind of anxious about certain things, then you're a hypocrite, one. But then it got weird where everyone kept using black examples. That's the part I don't think you saw. So they'll say that girl at MIT is far safer than a black kid living in Atlanta where there's gunshots on the block every week. I said, you do realize every black person doesn't live on a block where gunshots are being fired every night. And then another comment was about, well, she's safer than a black kid in West Baltimore. So it became, I found myself acting like many of the pro-blacks to just say, can you make your argument about the Jewish situation without talking about black people? Right. That's what I thought was odd. It's like, yeah, but look at the blacks. Yeah, somebody might be screaming threats on your college campus, but at least you're not black. That seemed odd to me.
Well, I mean, it's again just an apples and oranges comparison. So, I mean, if the topic is like, do people feel unsafe on campus? And for years, the political left has been saying that people feel unsafe on campus because someone slapped them on the ass at a fraternity party. Not that it's cool, or, somebody misgendered them, or, somebody touched their hair. Like, there are multiple articles
Ask
at
them
like
where
the
they
level
were from.
of Post. Yeah, exactly. Like there are multiple articles like, then a cute white boy who I was going to give the number to touched my hair, and there are hundreds of comments under them. So we've been hearing this for a long time. And now there actually are mobs of people on the major campuses that are brawling with Jewish students, ripping down flyers of kidnapped rape victims, doing pretty crazy stuff. I mean, like at Cooper Union, it turned out that was exaggerated a little bit, but there were a bunch of kids that were in a back library with a literal mob banging on the door, slamming objects into it. I mean, so it's one or the other. Like the people on the left, including Glenn on this topic, definitely can't say one of these things is valid, but the other one isn't. The question is whether conservatives who don't think the first thing is valid should think the second thing is valid. I think, yeah, it's exaggerated, but it's valid. Like, again, there aren't any mobs chasing black people. Like, this is the important thing. Like, this is kind of what I think about January 6th, too, like big embarrassing riot. But the simple reality is, had that happened in reverse, the perspective would have been entirely different. I mean, we saw the pro-Palestine protesters brawling with the police at the White House and the Capitol this week.
Right.
And it's, sorry, that is a little bit off topic, but it's the same thing here. Like, if you're a black student on an Ivy League or Big Ten campus, you are almost never at any risk. In fact, you are very likely one of the most pampered, coddled people ever to exist. Like there are whole majors that exist just for you so you don't fail out that are 70+% African American. Professors are terrified to give you low grades. Like, I mean, I am an academic. So the idea that a group of people would march through the campus chanting "fuck Africa," there's no chance of that ever happening. Like it would be the biggest story in the USA for 2 years. Hundreds of people would be suspended. So I don't think that the comparison with ordinary Black people makes much sense. And so you saw this in the thread, which actually just pulled up, where people started reaching. And like one guy was like, I think it was Zaid Jelani, he was a good guy, but said, well, what about West Baltimore near the dope houses? Like, this is what you just referred to. That's not the same thing.
Right.
Like, we understand that anonymous poor people, as much as it sucks to say that, face more danger than the head of like the Jewish student union at Cooper Union. That doesn't affect the case, which is whether the head of the Jewish student union at Cooper should feel scared. And yeah, a little bit.
Right.
It doesn't counter that to say, well, soldiers in Iraq, every day they face things you couldn't imagine. Well, no shit. They also have guns. It's a completely different scenario that you're just bringing from the edge of the map.
Yeah, and he's a really sane guy, and we usually have, I mean, it wasn't like an attack, but I just thought that he wasn't really seeing what I was saying. And it also, I mean, I didn't think it in his case because, I kind of know where he comes from, and I don't believe so. But if some anonymous person was replying to the Glenn comment that way, you would think that that's borderline racist in the sense that you're saying this is what Black life is like, right? It's like, it's like the anti-racist we had on a couple of weeks ago, where the one woman said something. I asked her, the white woman, I asked her something about the part in the book where she wrote that, I had trauma. I had all these things happen to me when I was, and I was concerned. I felt kind of like a victim, and I knew I had struggles. But then I looked and I said, well, what am I thinking about all this for? Look at the Blacks, right? It's almost like saying, God, oh yeah, I've been raped and I've been in prison and I've been homeless for 3 years, and I got an infection and they might have to amputate my leg, but hey, at least I'm not Black. I mean, that's not really a ringing endorsement for what you think Black life is like, and it's not true, right? That's the other piece.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a point I want to make. Like, I argue a lot about these topics like income and IQ, and it's true that Blacks in America are underperforming whites in America. But that's one of fairly few groups that Blacks in America, or Asians in America, certainly whatever, are underperforming. I mean, like the global average IQ is like 82. Average income is like $8,000. I mean, we have some fatherless issues. The average income for a Black family is around 50. I mean, you're talking about a mean or a median there. Like, I mean, half the Black population is above that. Black men make, before you adjust for anything, 85, 90% of what white men do. So the whole idea that everyone who's Black lives in a tent outdoors or in the projects is not accurate. And I don't think that's what Zaid was saying. But I mean, it is. I recently read Lawrence Otis Graham's Our Kind of People, which is a discussion of the Black upper class, where he points out almost casually that 14 or 15% of Blacks are not only upper middle, but upper class. I mean, low six figures on up, college degrees, happily married families. So when you think about Black Americans that are going to college, yeah, you're not talking about some brutalized, oppressed group in the first place, certainly at Cooper or at Columbia or whatever. But I think all this is kind of a distraction from the point. Like, I would agree that someone standing outside the trap house at 3 a.m., Black or in Appalachia, white, has a tougher life than some Jewish kid that has to listen to mobs outside all day. But those are two different scenarios. Like, everyone agrees the first kid has a terrible life. Like, no one doesn't think that that person's at risk. So if you're saying Jewish students that pay $37,000 a year to come to Columbia or MIT are only half as frightened as people that are selling dope, that's not good. That's a dramatic transition from 0% as frightened. And I think it's perfectly valid to ask, well, what caused that? And last thing, but again, like, we see this a lot on the political left, where crazy shit goes down. I mean, we sometimes forget how nutty the summer of Floyd was. Where, I mean, in Minneapolis, there was a medieval style battle where rioters, about half Black and half white, with fucking falchions, like metal bats, machetes, attacked a police company, whatever you call them. 100 some cops are in the station. Fighting goes on for a day. Pepper gas is going on. Helicopters are in the sky. Finally, the police have to retreat, like in good order, dragging their wounded. And the rioters burn down the police station. I mean, it's like Fort Apache type crap, like wars 100 years ago. 200 years ago. So that sort of thing has kind of gotten a pass from society. There was literally 100 times as much coverage, if you look at Google citations of January 6th, as of that. So again, today it's at a lower level, but we're seeing absolutely insane stuff. I mean, mobs of hundreds of thousands of people in London. I'd say New York and Chicago, certainly combined, got over 100K. I mean, crowds filling the streets. And the chants are things from the river to the sea, gas the Jews, intifada, revolution. That is the solution. I mean, like a lot of the two of those three literally mean kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's pretty reasonable to react negatively to your enemies saying they want to kill you.
Right. And one good thing to your point, it goes to the next topic, talking about, because you mentioned briefly at the beginning, agreeing with Glenn because of the hate crime on the rise thing that people say, but and you're right about, even if it's true, it's all relative. So you got to talk about how much it's on the rise and where it's on the rise from. That's important. But there's another factor that you mentioned that's important. At the end, you talked about this, back to the woman at MIT, and saying the apples and oranges comparison, and saying that she, having whatever level of risk she may or may not have, everyone agrees that it's lower than the kids hanging outside the trap house. But it still could be, they're not the same because the expectations would be different, but there still may be, whatever level there is at the college campus, if there's protests and they turn violent. But the other thing is, the catalyst for all this is 10/7, right? So October 7th is where you need to set your anchor in your guide to measure things from, right? Because you have to have, some standard that you're measuring against. So the question isn't what they're facing on MIT's campus or anywhere else. It's like, is it different from pre and post 10/7? And I say that to this, if they want to use the apples and oranges example of the trap house or West Baltimore or the block in Atlanta, the random block in Atlanta, we could argue that let's use that if you choose to. And what has changed in those three scenarios from October 6th to October 8th, and what has changed on MIT and Columbia's campuses in that time frame. And if you compared it that way, you would still have a measurable difference, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important statistical point, and this actually kind of irritates me. I mean, so like I've argued on both sides of this. Like when talking with alt-right whites, when people start freaking out on black and white crime, one thing I'll often point out is that this is 3% of crime.
Right.
And it just is. I mean, like in the year I used for research, 2019, BJS and CVS, there were a little under 100,000 white on black crimes. There were almost 600,000 black on white crimes. Both of those, I'm exaggerating the numbers a little just to give a round number.
Right.
But I mean, like you've got 700,000 crimes out of 20 million crimes. Mm-hmm. So when people say, well, that's 80% black on white, it's like, well, sure. But it's also 3% of crime. Like, why are you focusing on this 3% of crime? Why not focus on the 97% of crime? I mean, like, if you look at crime against whites, 63% of it was just committed by whites. Then you've got Caucasian Hispanics. Then you've got situations where the attacker is unidentified, probably white. And I don't even think domestic violence and so on is included in that particular BJS table, right? So I mean, attacks on blacks the same. It was like 70% non-Caucasian black. So people on either side, and again, there are 5 times as many whites as blacks. If you want to play these numbers games, but when bigots on either side are like, well, look, tell you what, almost 30%. It's like, why are you focusing on this tiny chunk of this? And you kind of know the reason, right? So I mean, that, I guess, is an example of almost taking one of the two possible positions here when it's necessary. But another point you can make, and this is the valid non-racist right-wing point about interracial crime, is that things have comparative baselines. So if the media is going to talk about interracial crime all the time, which makes no sense, but it's perfectly valid to point out that it's 80% black on white. I mean, and that is despite the fact that interracial crime is a much less serious threat than intraracial crime, if that makes sense. Right. So similarly, like in baseline terms, it's a much bigger story that crime against Jews went from 0 to 50 than it is that crime in the hood went from, didn't go anywhere, stayed at 95. It was 95, now it's 95.
Right.
I mean, the Jewish thing is a story because there was a situation where there wasn't a problem and now there's a problem.
Right.
It's kind of rambling there, but the answer pretty much sums up why we should care about one and not the other.
No,
Like
I like that, and to that point, I should go back to that. I mean, I used to say, your stat about the 3% being small, because the left and the right use it, right? The right uses it in the way that you mentioned, and the left will say, "Oh, we have to focus specifically on criminal justice reform and specifically to how blacks are treated because blacks are XYZ, and where they're committing crime is not their fault. They're committing crime, and even the black community, unfortunately, they'll kind of not really forgive, but they'll kind of excuse away bad behavior because they feel like, well, we can't be putting us down, right? But I think that even the people doing it, like the Candace Owenses we'll get to later on, they do a disservice because they argue it wrong. If they argued it like you and I, you could still make the point you make and not sound like you're putting down blacks. Because I used to say we need to create T-shirts and say we are the 97%. Right, because to the right, to the people who say blacks are violent, it will say it's only 3%. Get over it. But to the people who feel the need to excuse behavior because I don't want to put down another black person, what they really should be saying is stop it because 97% of us are law abiding, and that's just a small percentage of people, and they need to be dealt with. Right, so don't own their bad behavior, but instead they don't think it. They've been hearing the numbers, and so they feel inclined to defend it instead of just saying, well, nobody in my family is doing this. Nobody I know is going around shooting and stabbing people. That's not black norm. It's not black culture. And it's just bad people as it is in any other group. And they just need to be dealt with.
Yeah, this is something I genuinely don't understand about the black community, and I think we're going to talk through it now. But so yeah, first of all, that 3% figure, that is the figure for the total amount of interracial violent crime against all index crime. And it's also, which is I think what you were referring to, about the figure for the number of blacks that are active criminals at any time.
Violent crime anyway, yeah.
Yeah, violent criminals, yeah. Felony conviction, violent crime within any X period of time. I mean, so I'd freely admit, like, for whites it might be 1.5, and for Asians it's almost nothing. But that doesn't change the point that 97% of your black buddies, just like 98% of your white buddies, are going to be normal people. And that sentence, like 97 and 98, really illustrates a problem. This is my quantitative mentor used to call this backward margin reporting, where you look at something like you come up with a bullshit statistic like black babies are 7 times as likely as white babies to die. We both talked about this online in one of these long threads once, and it turns out
that the guest brought it up. That was her main point. Whenever we push back on something, she's like, "But look at the black mothers and the black babies that are dying."
But the problem with a statistic like that is that it almost invariably comes from the fact that black babies are like 99.1% likely to survive, and white babies are like 99.7% likely to survive. So there are two ways to read that. One is that there are virtually no baby deaths, and that the gap is probably due to perhaps slightly more poorly trained black doctors. Both groups are obviously doing well if it's 99% living, or in a diet, something like that. The second way is just to take that 1% and say, well, 0.7 is X times 0.1, so we've got a real problem here. And you see that a lot. And it's the same thing with crime. And sure, it's legitimate to say, like, okay, most people aren't murderers, so who has the most murderers? But when you get into common crimes overall, and you're ignoring the fact that like 95+% of all races don't commit them, there's a reason you're doing that. Like, I have a Bukele approach to crime, like the El Salvador boss man, where it's like, I mean, if you just caught every young male who had done, more than 2 incidents above level X in the past 2 years and threw them in prison for 10 years, there'd be no crime. Yeah. I mean, it really would be that simple. And the prison would be very integrated, by the way. It'd be like 40% white, 30 to 40% black, at least 20% Hispanic. Again, no Asians, no Jews. No offense to those fine groups. They would not be there. Maybe a couple guards,
right?
Guys who didn't get into law school that year. But I mean, like, that's just a reality. Like, it doesn't matter the racial composition of the prison, because outside it, no one would then be a criminal. So all these are interesting points, and I think that they tend to be under discussed. But that issue of baselines is important.
Yeah.
Like, it's fair to critique the higher black baseline. It's also fair to critique the more rapidly rising Jewish baseline, that kind of thing.
Right. The last thing on crime is about the increase. Now, I'm not completely questioning the increase. I'm a little dubious because hate crime and hate speech are tied together because they're incidents. I don't really agree with the hate crimes, just punish the crime. And hate speech, I mean, is it really a crime? It's a speech. What did they say, right? You know, in this climate, I can see how a Jew would feel, you know, I'm pro-Palestine, free Gaza. It's hate speech, but it's protected speech. It's not actually hate speech. And people get to decide what it is. But the other problem I have, so we had our school board meeting last night and we were debating a resolution. And so it's all about, you know, Israel and Hamas and, you know, dealing with hate and having everybody saying their piece. And the one thing, so they're rabidly against each other, polarized. But the one thing they agreed on, there was actually a resolution I was the only one to vote no on, because they all disagreed rabidly on this. And the only thing they agreed on was like, the way we need to stop this is we need to educate people. We need to educate people. We need to teach this. We need to educate people. And I said, stop. The last thing I want is to educate people on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, and all these other things. That's the last thing I want. And I say, I know everybody in this room is going to disagree with me, but you've just given me the proof in all your arguments about things. Everything is so heightened and passionate and emotional, right? So if we say teach this, who's teaching it, right? What are their views? Who gets to control what they use and what they say is facts and the norms? So do you really want, do you really want the teachers in the school today teaching about these hot button issues? No, because they're going to because you're opening the door to allow them to bring their views into the classroom. And then, so I turned to them, I said, okay, I'm going to ask you all a question rhetorically, but I want you to nod. For the last 4 years, we've been talking nonstop, from George Floyd to transgender drag queen and bathrooms to now the Israel-Hamas situation. Nonstop about race, gender, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. So ask yourselves, with all this talk about it, all the articles, all the writing from Biden's bully pulpit, everywhere, do you think it's gotten better? And everyone's like, no. So what makes you think if you continue to talk about it and you bring it into the classroom, it's going to get better? The more you get more of what you promote. So if we keep promoting hate, we're creating more hate. So that's the reason I think just going around talking about it and telling our kids, we need to talk to the kids about this. We need to sit down with the kids in the classroom. One, we don't know who's doing it. And I don't trust the people who be having the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, so I pretty much agree with that. I mean, first of all, you know, if a student asks about anti-Semitism, given some of the treatment I've seen of Jewish and even Muslim kids, like, of course, as a teacher, you should be prepared to answer. You know, the board should make some flyer or something. But a real point that's ignored far more often than it should be is that if you tell people in detail how to do something bad but tempting, they're more likely to do it. So, like, there are dozens of studies of this, like Tom Sowell, the OG's OG. But I mean, he, in one of his books, looks at the effect of pleasure-based sex education, where, like, previously in school, you know, sex ed was like, this is a penis, this is a vagina, maybe this is a clitoris, probably in separate sections. Then, you know, 3 days on all the diseases you're going to catch, and, you know, how to put a condom on a banana, and that's it. And I actually kind of approve of that. You know, you don't want them screwing around too much. You tell them the basics, they can figure the rest of it out. Go to the library. But when pleasure-based sex ed began, when people started talking for days about different sexual techniques and how some people are gay and so on, the argument was that this would decrease teen pregnancy, for example. People would be more sexually experienced and trained, and they could, you know, use a condom, so on down the line, oral sex, things that wouldn't get anyone pregnant. It turned out that what happened was that pregnancy skyrocketed like 300 or 400%. Because you were describing all these new sexual techniques and positions. And so these kids are like 15. They're not going to intelligently pull out or buy 2 boxes of Magnums and keep them at home. What's your dad going to say about that? So just discussing sex in detail and telling kids that sex was okay led to more sex. It's one of the most obvious, but also most counterintuitive social science findings. Same thing with drugs. Like when they did DARE education, where you go through all the drugs and their prices and where you can usually buy them, and then you're like, but don't do this. drug use, not much, but increases. Like when I was a kid in Chicago, like the Dare Lion shirts were a joke.
Mhm.
Like people started going to raves in high school and you'd wear that to a rave to imply you wanted drugs. So I mean, like, it's just that's very common. It's the same thing. Like, if you do an hour-long panel discussion on the insults for Jews and why people have a problem with Israel and why people have a problem with Palestine, do you think that's going to decrease like Jewish Muslim fistfight incidents? I would guarantee like 85 to 100%. No, it will increase them.
Right.
So yeah, to a
Because you're
certain
going to
extent.
bring people into the fight who normally didn't care about it at all. Because they're like, now I didn't know this. I agree with this side. And so now you're creating this feeling that wasn't there before.
The assumption that like the average high school boy has a pre-existing professional knowledge of the Palestinian cause is crazy. I mean, it's I don't like to say people are stupid, but I mean it's just the lack of knowledge about most of these issues is incredibly intense. Like most people have seen either a Jewish or Palestinian TikTok video, and they might have a slight side preference. But if you literally explain like the Balfour Declaration and so on, I think you'll have either no change in the rate of violence or an increase. People will understand the situation more so on down the line. I would also question like in a lot of these settings, like have there been a lot of incidents of Islamophobia or whatever in the New York schools in your district?
Not a lot, but what they're saying is that, so what this is a perfect example. So what, and where it is, I mean, people shouldn't do it and I'm against it, but they still are not talking about being honest about what the catalyst was, right? So
Oh
one
yeah.
example was people were doing all the protests, the free Palestine kind of stuff, and so a mom's group started, this chat thing about protecting our kids. Our kids are afraid to go to school. They're Jewish, whatever. And then somebody was like, "Well, what about Islamophobia? But Palestinians are being treated kind of bad," and they got dumped on in the chat. Well, first of all, it's a social media chat, so it's basically a cesspool of the worst of behavior of humans, right? So their argument was why the schools needed to address Islamophobia is because of that. And ironically, they do this. So you mentioned London, Australia, the things that happen all over the world, all over the country, incidents in the school, incidents in big cities in America, 10, 100, 200,000 people. And every one of them would reference, when they talk about Islamophobia, the unfortunate 6-year-old who was killed in Chicago. Sad, violent, terrible, stemming from this Hamas attacks, yes. But that's their one argument. They can't even give you one in the city, right? They'll say, yeah, this is what's happening. So a lot of it is just people reacting to the reaction that happened after 10/7. So it still goes back to that as the catalyst, but it's still not nearly as much as what has been taking place and the things that have been said towards Jewish people. No, but I mean, I won't say that they're wrong about it happening, and it's unfortunate, but it's not violent, right? If somebody says, shut up, whatever, you're replying in some chat room, you just get out of the chat room. It's not like they're following you home or something.
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest comments of all time is the rapper Tyler, the Creator, when he was talking about cyberbullying, and he was in a very serious thread about youth mental health, and people kept bringing up cyberbullying, and he was finally like, "Ha ha ha! How the hell is cyberbullying real? Nigga, just log off the computer!" And it like all these exclamation marks, and it's the funniest single tweet or Instagram post of all time. Like you have to see it. It's like 3 sentences of his take on this like therapeutic culture, and he's like, "Get the fuck out of here!" And he just logs off and goes and does his thing. But I think that that's generally my opinion. So, in terms of the New York City schools, I don't think there needs to be a formal training with new bureaucrats hired or consultants or something to talk about anti Semitism or Islamophobia. Tell teachers that there's a general anti bullying policy and they should invoke that when kids ask them questions, and that's it. But one thing you said that's kind of interesting there is like a lot of hostility toward at least Arab Americans resulted from the fact that Hamas did attack Israel and start a bloody war.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, like, obviously that shouldn't be used to penalize some Palestinian kid in your class. But that's like when people talk about stereotypes and stereotype accuracy, leftists often pretend as though the things people think about each other don't come from reality or something close to it. Like they're just totally arbitrary. Like people might have the stereotype Irishmen are sober or Koreans are lazy as easily as they have the stereotypes that we have now. And that's obviously not reality. Like the reason the Palestinian cause is now kind of in some disrepute in like the donor class, and people think of at least some young Muslim men as potential terrorists, is that we saw this terror attack on October 7th. Like, we need to remember the Palestine started the war. Like, this is the thing. Like, people are kind of teasing me about writing for Israel on social media. I'm not a passionate, I am an Israel supporter, but I'm not normally like a passionate everyday backer of either country. It's just really obvious that the war is Palestine's fault. I mean, like, Hamas broke the border. It's a classic casus belli declaration of war on October 7th. They killed 1,400 people, at least 1,200. There are all these beheadings, rape, torture. Most of this stuff's on video. There's a 45-minute presentation showing it. People aren't just making it up. You can see the pirated version on Telegram, apparently. So
but,
I mean,
but I hate to interrupt you, but I like how when people they question some of it, right? So they'll say, "You'll say what you said," and they'll say, "Nope, nope, that's not true. There were no beheadings." And instead of getting a debate with them, I say, "So the 1,400 dead is okay." Going into homes and kill people in the neighborhood, so it's okay if they didn't rape them or behead them. So that's what I'm saying. Well, I'm just saying you said beheading and it's not true. Right.
They clearly also raped them. I mean, they're like video. I'm like, this isn't a topic I want to go into like gory detail about, but like they're videos of like captured Israeli soldiers like bleeding through their pants and like women and wearing only ripped panties like did in the back of trucks and so on. I mean, so this whole argument of like Hamas wouldn't do that is unbelievably silly. Like, rape of women and killing of men, unfortunately, happen in almost every war. And the argument that that wouldn't go on in a war this intense between like the biblical Jews and Arabs is insane. It's that desperate desire not to know what you're backing. Like, if you're supporting Hamas, you're supporting these murderous rapists that took their paragliders and flew into a rave and killed everyone there. And there's no way to get around that by invoking these crazy scenarios. Like, what if the Israelis were shooting at them and killed all the ravers? The two armies used different bullets. I mean, like, we know what happened. So there's a great deal of denial of that. But the reality is that the October 7 massacre is the thing that launched the war. And everyone at some level knows that it's Palestine's fault. When's the war going to be over? When the side that started the war surrenders. There's a law of war. It's written down in big leather-bound books that have been around since Kipling and the Geneva Conventions. I mean,
right. And why don't they even talk about, they talk about, well, we want a ceasefire. Like, I hate to be like everybody else and shockingly invoking him, but when Fetterman was asked, he just said, well, why don't you release the hostages first? But forget about whether they release them. They're not even, the people who are protesting aren't even asking for them to be released. They're not even saying, I want a ceasefire and I want Hamas to release the hostages. They just say, ceasefire, stop what you're doing and go home and everything will be okay.
Insane. So I mean, it's talking about how insane that is. I mean, so again, I joke on this show about being from the business world, a bit pragmatic, let's say. But I mean, like, all of this is just established human thought. It's quite morally defensible. There's a recognized law of war. People that aren't involved in a war after one party starts a war with another party can't ask the party that was viciously attacked to stop fighting. That's not a rule. Like, the only thing that a ceasefire would do is strengthen the position of Hamas. Like, Hamas is in this system of tunnels, fortified bunkers, and so on that exists throughout the Gaza Strip. And what they're going to be doing, they're a pretty good small army. If you give them the chance, is just building that stuff up. They're going to be digging deeper, stockpiling more rounds, putting the suicide vests on. And again, of course, every day the hostages are going to be beaten, raped. I mean, they're hostages during a time of war. So unless Israel's just accepted them as a loss, Hamas is not giving them back. They have to go get them back. Mm-hmm. So anyone calling for a ceasefire is saying, well, tolerate another week or so of rapes while the enemy fortifies their position. It's an absolutely insane thing to ask. Like, what's supposed to happen during the ceasefire? Mm-hmm. Like, the Palestinian civilians, both sides have said they can leave Gaza, they can move within Gaza. So that's not something that's going to change. This is just an argument essentially made by people that want Hamas to stay in power. It really is that simple. Like, most of the American left is cheering for Hamas. They think that Hamas are some sort of colonial revolutionaries, and they want them to remain in position. They don't want them removed by the Israeli government.
Or stupid. There's another thing. You were too kind to not want to go that far. I don't want to say people are dumb. So it could be that they want Hamas in power, but they could be stupid. And some evidence of that is Can you talk a little bit about Bin Laden's new mixtape? Apparently, he's making a comeback. He's the new hit out there on social media now, because everyone's telling all their friends to read the letter to America. And oh my God, he was right. What do you think about all that?
I thought this was a joke when I first saw it. Like the number one trend on TikTok was Bin Laden, and people were like posting pictures of Bin Laden on their profiles. I mean, it's just insane. And again, I mean, this has to really amuse the Chinese. Remember that the Chi-Com government is the primary owner, if not the sole owner of TikTok, or I mean, whatever their front group is. Everything over there is owned by the leadership of the Communist Party.
Even Disney. But go on.
So the Bin Laden situation is Osama bin Laden in 2002 wrote a letter explaining why he attacked on 9/11. And the two things that I got from that are Bin Laden's about as aggressive and predatory as I thought, evil guy in conventional terms, one, and two, he's also a terrible writer. Like I've actually read this years ago. I mean, it's common in political science curriculum. It's about a 3-pager. But Bin Laden says that the West is oppressing the peaceful Muslim Ummah, the population of the Muslim world. Muslims wouldn't go to war without the West, which is laughably false. But just on and on and on. The West won't let the Palestinians rest. And for whatever reason, The Guardian republished this on their website recently, and it started going viral. People started looking at it. The newspaper actually took it down because they didn't want this to be the number one search for them. And so people started claiming that the US and UK governments had hidden this letter. They were trying to keep it out of the public eye. So it's going on. It's been trending for days with people saying, Bin Laden spit in that fire. Bin Laden told us exactly why he attacked. And it's, again, just sort of this kind of stupid cliche liberal shit. Like, do you think this terrorist is telling the truth? Like, ask him what he thinks about gay people. Well, you can't. He's in hell. But I mean, like, it's just a lot of issues. I think your mic might be off. Mic might be.
Yeah, muted. I saw that. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it's just kind of another crazy thing that's been going on. Like I said, it's been a crazy week, and it's just a fine point on all of the other madness. One other thing I wanted to talk about briefly is the controversy over at Daily Wire. I try to stay out of, we've had Kira Davis on talking about Candace and how she approaches the Black community. I talked about her when she went from Turning Point to PragerU to now Daily Wire. Everyone has an opinion on her, I guess. I didn't really care either way. So I don't really care much about this one. You can let everybody know whatever your thoughts are on it. But what I find interesting is that all of this stuff kind of is, it's not government, so not technically, but it's kind of creating strange bedfellows and pulling at the threads of what we consider free speech, right? So people are always like, what you can say, what you can't say. Are you going to do this? We talked about Glenn Greenwald earlier. One of his tweets was about, all of these people, unfortunate people, were being fired just for, being pro-Palestinian, and all the people on the right celebrating it when they were against cancel culture. So now we're all okay with it again. But things are situations. Some of the people were pretty violent in what they were doing. But Candace is interesting because Candace has been for a couple of weeks, pretty much railing against Israel. The Israeli, the views, the negative views on Israel from the Israel-Hamas conflict tend to fall into a couple buckets. One, obviously openly anti-Semitic, that does exist and it's out there. Two, the people who are just anti-war, who are just like, I don't want to go to war. I don't want America to be in anybody else's business, whether it's Ukraine or there. People who don't, who use it from a tying the anti-capitalism, like Greta Thunberg, and saying, yeah, they're all occupiers and they're white and all this other stuff, right? And so that all kind of conflates, so it brings in different groups of people. So Candace has been going on and on, right? So I guess, I don't know what she said that set him off to that point. So Ben Shapiro's mentioned that what she said was disgusting. And what I thought about it was, it's kind of weird, interesting to watch to see what happens, because he feels he can't fire her, right, because of what it will look like. She doesn't want to quit because she was like, I don't need to be a quitter. But at the same time, if he truly thinks that what she's saying is so disgusting and borderline propaganda, right? So he's a Jew, he owns the company. If she was on there spewing Nazi propaganda, he would be like, free speech be damned. I want you, this is a private company. I cannot allow you on my airwaves to do this, right? But he tweets at her like, well, why don't you quit? So there's that, like, this little, cat and mouse game going on. And it's just pretty interesting. It's like, who's going to blink first? But it seems like, the people who are picking sides are really kind of, I guess, not doing it specifically just because of the topic. It may be their views on Candace and their views on being writ large. So what do you think about it?
I mean, so first of all, one of my tips, like we've both been bosses. I like Ben Shapiro. I've talked with Ben Shapiro personally online, so on. But I mean, my suggestion for a lot of these situations, this is also what I think about the Gen Spec, like man in a dress controversy, where the decently well-known writer Phil Illy, who we've had on here, he wore a dress one day. He identifies as autogynephilic, and a lot of feminists, in my opinion, freaked out about this, but they had some points as well, back and forth. Like all of this stuff and this controversy, a couple others, James Lindsay was dragged into this.
Yep.
Shapiro, Owens, Crowder got involved in that. My honest one sentence take is, don't these people have phones? Like, if you have a problem with one of your leading subordinates, if I'm a sales director or something, I just call him and I ask, hey, man, could you stop talking about abortion with our clients or something? I'm not going to, and I actually am kind of shy. I think I've told you that before, but I'm not going to be posting like these tongue in cheek Twitter posts like, a little bit of discussion about babies these days. I mean, like, no, just go out there, call them,
Right.
tell them. The only reason that might not have happened with Shapiro is that Ben Shapiro was at a private event, I think, like liquor serving event. It looks like he's standing on a table. And I'm not implying any of these people are wasting or anything, but it's a forum where you're expected to tell the truth. And he's asked, what do you think of Candace Owens' behavior? And he says, it's disgraceful, I think, and tries to move on. And people start clapping, they're standing up. And there's a brief follow. So once that was said, it's a little harder to call someone that's almost at your level and say, could you stop doing this? You're making us look bad, because now face, as the Chinese would say, is involved. But from 90% of this stuff could have been avoided by everyone just sort of keeping their mouth a little bit more shut and handling that behind closed doors. Same thing with relationship debates online. So that's my first take. My second take is that people like Glenn Greenwald and Candace Owens here actually do have a point, which is that the right freaked out about cancel culture for years, even for things that were pretty serious, like the wife of a well-known Serbian soccer player said that looters in one of the cities were like black animals and cattle, and they should be shot down by the state, which is kind of a risky thing for a Serb to say, given recent history. I mean, and he was apparently liking the posts. I don't want to misstate that, but like, even for stuff like that, everyone, including me, I wrote about this for Spiked, was like, no, you don't fire people for that. The initiation,
right. Because they fired him, not her, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. It was from his wife, but she shouldn't have been fired either. So people were making bold statements about cancel culture. I think that's fair to say. And now there are people coming out and saying sometimes just shit like free Palestine and being doxxed. I mean, like at Harvard, every student member of the organizations that signed this admittedly stupid letter had their faces put on like billboard trucks. Right. And these were traversing the town, like blasting out the sins of these kids. You can argue for that or against that, but it's a hell of a change. Mm-hmm. So I will say there's some hypocrisy there. I also will say that I think Glenn's point is a little weaker than he presents it as being. The problem with most cancel culture, so I gave an example that was debatable, but with most of it was that it was just stupid shit. Right. Like a white guy is hanging out with his close black buddies and his black girlfriend and raps the N-word along to a hit song. It was the #1 song in the country, My Nigga. So you can't have a society where YG and Yo Gotti and so on are producing #1 anthems that use this allegedly magic word. A hip-hop white kid who's probably by no means 100% Caucasian says the word, and then you end his career. Right. Like, crazy story still, like Florida cut him, right? So he tried to go to a historically black college. He was a quarterback at the University of Florida, incoming quarterback. So he's like, I'm not racist, and smaller schools are pitching me. What if I go to an HBCU? So the HBCU is like, great, we'd love to have you. I thought it was going to be a wonderful story. No, the board of the HBCU cuts him. They say the coach has to let the kid go. So he's now at like a community college, but he's coming back next year. This was cancel culture. This went on for years. And there's no comparison between that and actually saying gas the Jews. Right. There's no comparison between that and actually being the person that wrote out the Harvard 34 letter or signed it from each one of those organizations. Right. So you can point out the hypocrisy. You can also recognize the difference between gas the Jews and I love black people riding with my, Right. So that I think is there. Final comment. Also, the First Amendment only, so I guess this is just a neutral side point. First Amendment only protects against the state, as you know, probably better than me as a broadcaster. So, like, Ben Shapiro could fire Candace Owens, depending on what her contract says. Like, Ben Shapiro is not the government, perhaps fortunately for anyone considering abortion or later life marriage or whatever. I mean, things have changed. Like, there'd be a lot of differences around here. But, so if he has a beef with an employee, can say, you've got to go. I don't think he will do that. Again, I think it would have been better for them just to talk. And also, I've been rambling for a little bit, so I want to hear what you have to say. But like, this also gets into the grifter allegations, right? Like, does Candace Owens? I'll just say, like, does she have any real interest in or knowledge of like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Like, is she really an evangelical Christian? Like the former party goer who went on Joe Rogan and said she wasn't, and was trading jokes
That's
about
not my
Charlie.
thing. Right.
Yeah, like Charlie Kirk thinks Jesus rose from the dead 3 days in, walked on water. I don't, Does Candace Owens really now believe in like a Christ is King Groyper version of Christianity? 100% no. Like, I don't know inside her mind, but it's really questionable, right?
Yeah, she's no Ayan Hirsi Ali. Well, we won't have time to get to that one. We got to come back to that one. But one thing I'll say briefly that is you're even kinder to the left because you use examples that are bad. You can say, well, society has decided white people can't say the N-word. When I think of cancel culture, I think of things like the UCLA professor who just was going on about his business doing things. Today is test day. He's passed out the test. Oh, you can't give tests.
Right.
George Floyd died. And they chased him off because he had death threats because he was giving the test that was scheduled that day, because you can't give a test to a black student in a college because a guy in Minnesota died, right? To compare that to, it would be a better world if all the Jews were dead. It's kind of crazy. I do agree with that. And I guess the last thing I want to say briefly is I want to talk about education briefly. I don't know if you saw your old hometown, Chicago, just went the opposite way of every other state on vouchers. They had a small voucher program. It was about 5 years in. Just short of, I think 9,600 students had taken advantage of it. Keep in mind, people, whatever your political thoughts are on public education and unions, to be eligible, you had to be low-income families. So these are low-income kids. 90% of them were Black and Hispanic. They got scholarships to go to Catholic schools, private schools, or whatever. Money followed the kid, the voucher thing. They got rid of it. The council just voted against it this past Tuesday. So now those kids have to go back to the failing schools they were in their neighborhood. Maybe some of them could have been into another school for 3 or 5 years. So now they have to go back. So that this is all about the kids, but they have to put the kids back in failing schools because they don't want school choice vouchers. And at the same time, my current, everywhere where I went and where I am now, state here in New York, they're considering eliminating the Regents exam, which in New York you have to take this exam in order to graduate high school.
So what do I think about that? I mean, I think it's all asinine. I mean, so in Chicago, we're not doing any better than New York. Right. I mean, in fact, in Louisville, we're not doing any better in New York or Chicago, but I don't want to go through a depressing litany of, increasingly smaller, large cities. In Chicago, we got our numbers back the other day, got these from a teacher buddy. And 82.5% of the kids, this is across races, by the way, this is Black, Irish, Italian, Mexican, newer immigrants, whatever, Puerto Rican. 82.5% of kids can't do math either at or above the basic level. Mm-hmm. I forget whether it's aren't proficient or aren't basic and are below basic, but either one's terrible. Either one's ass. I mean, it's supposed to be 60 above, Mm-hmm. And 74% can't read beyond that level. And again, this is across all races. Blacks were a little worse, not much worse. So what do I think about this? I mean, first of all, I think we talk so much about group gaps in terms of race. Does IQ play a role in terms of class? That we forget that performance overall is far more important than the size of the gap. So, I mean, I wrote a piece for Tom Donaldson, great guy, for America's Majority Foundation on charter schools. Mm-hmm. And decent paper. I'm actually going to redo some of the methods probably for free near future. But one of the things that struck me was that there are a lot of states where both blacks and whites did well because you had really intense hard body schooling, tutoring was available. Minnesota, for example, I think blacks were at 1110, whites were at 1250 on the SAT. Mm-hmm. That's an ACT state, so only about 60% of the kids took it, but it's still pretty damn high. Right. And then you had states where there was almost no gap. I'm thinking of Detroit, but where everyone was terrible. So like Bosnian kids, Arab kids from Dearborn and Detroit, so on. The white population, you're talking about like a 950 SAT, blacks were like 890, but everyone was again cheeks. Everyone was terrible. Like the average for blacks is substantially higher than what these scores were. The white average there was the average for blacks, actually.
Mhm.
So, I mean, you can get everyone down to an equivalent level of performance, but you have to do that by hobbling the fastest people.
Right.
So I mean, at school, I'm just completely old-fashioned about this. I want phonics methods. I want high IQ teachers. I want IQ tests for teachers. Long school day. I don't actually want a lot of participation from parents. I love Tiffany Justice, but this is actually one of my questions for Moms for Liberty on the show. Like, it went on for a while, but like, what books do you want to ban? Like, what are the ideological qualifications to be a teacher? And she had good responses, but I don't really want even that from the right, and I certainly don't want that from the left. I don't want mandatory training about gayness for people that are teaching kids to read. I want them to really understand the phonetic method of teaching people to read. So that's my answer. I think it would be very easy to pick those scores up. I think it would be very easy back in your state to implement a functional voucher program. There are people standing in the way of educating the kids. And that's why instead of the 1110 and the 1250, you've got two 900s. And that's just unacceptable. That's not what they're putting up in China.
And last thing, I'm sure you do not want in that focus that you do not want it two separate lanes based on race and gender and all that kind of thing. So you don't want to teach the black kids differently. You want to raise the standards and teach everybody the same, right?
Well, yeah, I got into a discussion once with someone, an intelligent guy, almost alt-right. I think it was Emil Kierkegaard. But his question was, my question for him actually was, what would it change if it turned out that there were, say, 5 percentage point group IQ differences? Now, I mean, like if you're from a starting baseline of there are no differences, like the test scores were the same and then they diverge, that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, we already know the test scores are a bit different.
Right.
So my perspective is just educate everyone as intensely as possible. Gaps will probably shrink, but even if not, 1110 is not a bad score.
Yeah.
And I've never really heard a satisfactory response to that. Like, no, we shouldn't educate the black kids differently. I don't have a problem with tracked ability performance. So if it turns out in an upper division class, you've got 65% whites and 7% blacks, and in a lower ability track, you've got 47% whites and 21% blacks. Whites are still the large majority in most areas of the country. That could happen. But I don't see that matters. Like, those would both be very integrated classrooms where people would actually be learning things. So that's kind of my point. Like, how do you actually solve the problems? And again, like with the 3% of crime, when people start obsessing about, like, I don't know if we'd ever close the last 5% of that gap, well, who gives a shit? I mean, I think we would. Interracial marriage would, if nothing else. But that's not the point. The point is how you can get the huge majority of the kids to read.
Yeah, you raise up as many people as you can, regardless of where they were with. It's great. I guess we can stop there. You can go put your feet up and probably keep working. But it's good. We should talk more often. I think Lou had a great idea there. But thanks.
I agree. You too, brother. To say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.